Hello there, welcome. In this video, I'm going to be ranking the 10 starting classes in Skyrim. So I have thousands of hours of experience in this game, mostly playing on legendary difficulty. And no, before you comment, I don't use followers or astronauts or spend 20 to 30 hours micromanaging the game's crafting and trading system to get ahead. I like to think that this game can actually be played on the higher difficulties in an entertaining way, and it's mainly about distance managing and tons of practice. I like to make guides with legendary in mind. This way it can be applied to the lower difficulties as well. So yeah, before we get started, I want to mention that technically you can make any build good in Skyrim. So I'm gonna primarily be focusing these rankings on early game. The more you'll play and the more you level up, the less your racial powers and starting stats matter, because the easier it becomes to replace one of the abilities that your character starts off with a shout or a spell or something like that. I've also decided to split them into tiers. So there will be essentially 3 tiers. Tier 1 is the worst, or tier 3 is the worst, tier 2 is the middle, and then tier 1. Because some of these races are so close together when it comes to like their actual advantages that it's kind of difficult to put them in a serious 1 to 10 scale. I will be ranking them like that anyways, but it will be tier based as well. So first up, and probably not to a lot of people's surprise, we got the Wood Elf. See, the thing about the Wood Elf's abilities is that it's very situational and you rarely get any use out of them. Command animals works when there are animals nearby, but how often do you come up against an animal and, let's say, a bandit, that animal can help you fight, right? That doesn't happen very often. The command animals feature is mainly useful to fish if you want to get some salmon roe, or if you just want to get some strong predators off of you, kind of like a panic button. Wood Elves are also the smallest character model in the game, which means that it impacts their movement speed the most. Movement in combat is by far one of the most underrated and overlooked things in Skyrim, and this is something that is fixed on your class. You cannot change it later on, and it will be the same in correlation to every other class. The next 3 races are pretty much all equally bad, I would say, at least in contrast to the other ones, but I have to put them somewhere, and I've decided to go with the Red Guard. The Red Guard is just a guy with poison defense. That's really it. Adrenaline Rush is made redundant by Vegetable Soup. Vegetable Soup is by far and a country mile one of the best items in the entire game, no questions. And unfortunately, this is the same thing as the Red Guard's Adrenaline Rush ability. If Vegetable Soup was not in the game, I would potentially put Red Guard as one of the top 5 races, because there would be no other way, aside from late game enchanting, there would be no other way to get perpetual power attacks, which is stagger is a very good thing to use in combat. Now, personally, I actually do like the poison defense of the Red Guards. Whenever you do play on the higher difficulties, enemies like Falmer and Charises are very difficult, and a lot of the dungeons that hold Falmers and Charises have great rewards at the end of them. A lot of the Dwarven dungeons, a lot of the essentially the powers that you can get from completing a quest, a lot of them do house Falmers and Chars, so they are a very difficult enemy to fight, and they're always locked to level 9, so they will never be any lower than 9. While there is not a lot of difference between the Red Guard and the next race, which is going to be the Imperial, I decided to put the Imperial here. Essentially, this is another guy, and this guy essentially has the ability to calm human enemies down. The extra gold that you find in chests is actually not very useful. Let's say, for argument's sake, that you loot 100 chests, and you somehow manage to luck out, and you get 10 extra gold per those 100 chests. This will make you essentially 1,000 golds richer than any of the other races. It's hardly a drop in the bucket. Not to mention, most of the money in Skyrim comes from selling or crafting. It doesn't come from the physical gold that you pick up in chests. Next though, the Voice of the Emperor is relatively decent. It has a pretty large radius, and it affects human enemies up to level 99. This kind of acts like a panic button. However, it can only be used on humans, like I mentioned, so no creatures like Falmers, Mammoths, giants, everything. Generally speaking, creatures are more difficult than human enemies, except for maybe vampires. Those things are absolutely ridiculous. So Voice of the Emperor can be decent to calm them down. So next up we have the Kajit. Now, I know this is a lot of people's favorite race, but their abilities are very situational, similar to the Wood Elf. Being able to see in the dark is mainly for role-playing. I'm not really going to cover that. That's just a niche, weird little thing. And ironically enough, the unarmed damage of the Kajit is good, but not for the reason that everybody mentions that it's good, like making unarmed builds and stuff like that. Yeah, that's unique, but most players don't play that way. If you were, this would be one of the better classes. The reason I say the claw attack is good is basically to keep your levels low. You can make your way through the game, the early portions of the game, and collect good items while remaining a low level on your character, because unarmed is not tied to any skill, therefore it cannot level you up. Contrary to popular belief, early levels in Skyrim is not very useful when you're playing on the higher difficulties. Again, if you're playing on the lower difficulties, that doesn't really matter what you do. For the most part, you're gonna be fine. And not to go on a big rant, but the way you equalize the difficulty in Skyrim is through the use of equipment, like your armors and your weapons, not by leveling up. You have to think about it like, whenever you level up and you play on the higher difficulties, you essentially let the enemies level up 3 times. So you level up once, they level up 3 times. This is why equipment is how you equalize the difficulty curve. The races that we've talked about thus far are the weakest ones in Skyrim, and I would not necessarily recommend using them. The next 5 that we're going to talk about, this is tier 2. This is essentially the ones that you can use in any order you want, really. Doesn't matter that much. They're all very, very decent. But I've decided to start off with the Dark Elf. Now, though the Dark Elf is one of the best races for vampire builds, I'm mainly ranking this according to early game. Vampires is something you generally want to be later on in the game after you get a few perks and items and things like that. Making a good vampire build is hard because you have to deal with the weakness to the sun and the extra weakness to fire, which Dark Elves do cancel out. But it's more of a late game build. The Dark Elf's Ancestor's Wrath is very bad, really, even in early game. Dealing 8 points of damage to enemies is not that much damage. The good thing about the Dark Elf though is of course that fire resistance, and this will be useful throughout the entire game. It's a pretty easy, simple thing to understand. Fire resistance is just good. Next up, the Argonians. So the Argonians have 3 abilities, but I think that 2 of them are almost completely useless. Unarmed, we've discussed this with the Kajit, and water breathing is not good. Like it's just not good. There's not a lot of treasures underneath the water, and if they are, money is common, etc, etc. However, the Hiskin ability, that's by far their best ability. This allows your health to regenerate 10 times faster for 60 seconds. And this can be useful no matter what you're fighting. You could be fighting magic, you could be fighting melee, you could be fighting ranged. It's good against everything. And I believe the Hiskin ability sort of levels up as you do. I tested this on a character that had 100 health, and it seemed like it was giving me 5 points of health per second. But then when I tested it on a character that had 600 health, it seemed like it was giving me 50 points of health per second, because it took my health bar from basically 0 to 600 in around 12 seconds or so. So I believe this is an ability that levels up with you. I could be wrong, but it's kind of hard to test these things, especially when the wiki says 10 times faster. Like, what the hell does that mean? 10 times faster, according to what I know, that health regeneration in Skyrim is that there's a set number to it, but I think that number changes depending on how much health you have. So it's a complicated endeavor. But yeah, this can be stacked with the Ring and Amira, or the Parthenax Become Ethereal ability, or the Lady Stone. Though I don't recommend using the Lady Stone because it's one of the worst ones in the game. So coming in 4th place, I put the Nord. Very similar to the Dark Elf, only like the opposite resistance. The Nord is the 3rd tallest race in this game. Generally speaking, I would say frost damage is a little bit better. To resist frost damage is a little bit better than fire, because there are more enemies that do frost damage. Every enemy that does fire damage has an equivalent frost damaging enemy type. So a frost wizard and a fire wizard, a frost dragon and a fire dragon. However, there are unique enemies that only do frost, such as Draugrs, Wisp Mothers, Karstag, and also Falmers tend to use Frost or Shock at you. Now granted, Frost Defense is not that difficult to obtain. In the beginning, you can get the Helm of Ingol, 30% Frost Defense. If you use this on the Nord, it will bring you up to 80% Frost Defense. Couple that with the Lord or the Atronach Stone and you'll be pretty well set. Now the Nord's Battle Cry ability is very useful in situations where you get overwhelmed. It works on people and on creatures. It lasts for 30 seconds, has a range of 60 feet, and works up to NPCs up to 99. But it does count as a hostile act, so be careful using it around friendly NPCs. The Nord is just a solid race. Resistances to magic will just always be very, very good. So, and speaking of that, in 3rd place, we have the Breton. Pretty much takes the Nord and the Dark Elf's abilities and put them into one. These guys have 25% magic defense. One thing that I find kind of crazy, you can basically come out of Helgen, right? Do the Book of Love quest, and then pick the the Lord Stone, and you essentially have, the Book of Love doesn't require any combat, by the way, and you essentially have 85% magic defense. I actually watched a video because I like to watch the videos on YouTube about the topic that I'm gonna make a guide on, so that I can see what other people think. And this guy put the Breton at number 6. He actually put the Red Guard above the Breton, basically a guy that only has poison defense. I mean, there's personal preference, and then there's that. I don't even know. Anyways, the Breton Dragon Skin ability is to absorb 50% magicka that hits you. If you want to use this very often, you can actually couple this with the Atronach instead of the Lordstone. This way you can obtain 100% spell absorption for 60 seconds. Really helpful against dragons, Dragon Priest. Dragon Priests, by the way, are really useful to kill early game. Their problem is that they are level 50 or level 60, and they do a ton of damage with magic. You can also put on one of the Anniversary Edition armors. So you do the Book of Love, you do the Lordstone or the Atronach Stone, and then you put on the Dragon Imperial armor, and you are pretty much capped to all magic within the first half an hour of playing the game. You've barely done any combat. It is absurd. The Breton's resistance to magicka, especially combined with all the Anniversary Editions and the stone, this guy should just be top 3 in pretty much any sort of guide or ranking. At number 2, I've put the High Elf. Like I mentioned though, Dark Elves, Argonians, Nord, Bretons, and High Elf, between those classes, you can really pick anything you want. It doesn't really matter, whatever you find more fun. I think those 5 are significantly better than the first 4 that we talked about, but we are amongst themselves. You can pick any of them you want. Anyways, the advantages of High Elves is that they are the tallest race, therefore giving them the fastest movement speed, and they start off with extra 50 points of magicka, and oh my god, this is so useful. I almost always play High Elves, and I played some of the other races to get a grip with them, you know, throughout for the video, and it is so significant starting off with those 50 extra points of magicka early game, because you just essentially heal 50% more than everybody else. When you fight hand to hand against the enemies, you do take a lot of damage, and this definitely helps a lot. Imagine like a Souls game, if you were to start off with, you know, 50% more Estus Flask than everybody else for free. It's not like there's a drawback to this. They just essentially get this for free. So High Elves essentially have 2 abilities that nobody else get. It's the height. They will always be the tallest forever. And they also have 50 extra points of magicka, though this doesn't become as useful later on. But it's really about the beginning, because you can make anything useful in Skyrim later on in the game. Like I mentioned, it's the beginning where the differences between the characters matter. Also, they have their Highborn ability, which is pretty solid, 25 times magicka regen. This is good if you're a spellcaster, or for boss fights, or if you want to have a sword in one hand and just, you know, tag through the enemy's attack by healing yourself with the other. And Bethesda probably wanted you to play with this guy as a mage. I tend to use him mainly as a warrior because I do like to fight and move around. I love their movement the most. This is why I play them most of the time. And while on that topic of movement, I will continue to say this forever, because movement is one of the most underrated things in Skyrim. Because what everybody does when they play this game is that they walk up to the enemies and they just trade hits with them. And when you do that, of course you're gonna think Legendary is terribly balanced. It's funny to me, after 13 years of this game being out, the community has not found a way to evolve their combat and their fighting strategy. Everybody plays Skyrim in 2024 like they did when the game came out in 2011, 2012. Let's move on to number 1. The number 1 character is of course the Orc, if you couldn't guess this by now. The Orc's ability to do double damage and take half as much damage is something that never ceases to be useful throughout the entirety of the game, and is an ability that nobody else has. The Orc is also the second tallest race in Skyrim, granting you very decent movement speed. These guys are made for being a warrior, at least lore-wise. And you can also get into the Orc strongholds for free, but this isn't a big perk because you can do this very early anyways. Yeah, putting the Orc at number 1 I think is the least controversial thing. Most people do think Orc is the best race in Skyrim. So yeah, that was it. Hopefully you enjoyed the video, learned something, and I'll see you next time.